The government has pledged to end the use of hotels for housing asylum seekers in the UK as their claims are being processed. Today, we learned one of the ways they're planning to do that, the use of 2 former military facilities. What's going on? Will it work? And what are the political implications? We will discuss all of that on this latest episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Chris, you've been thinking about a subject you've been thinking about all year and many years before that, which is the asylum system.
Yeah, and the whole question of the various strands of conversation and debate and trade-off and difficulty that the country, the government wrestle with around those arriving on small boats. And, we were saying on an earlier episode of Newscast all of the questions that were raised by the sex offender who was released by accident from prison, who'd been staying in the hotel, the Bell Hotel in Epping in Essex, and then the whole question, which extends on from that really, which is how does the government go about housing all of those arriving on small boats? It comes at a considerable cost, particularly those who are in hotels. Around 30,000 asylum seekers are in hotels, according to the latest data. What are the alternatives? So many are housed in the community, is the phrase that is often used in these houses of multiple occupation, lots of people living in the same place. And one of the ideas that the previous government and this one have latched onto is using former military sites. And in the middle of all of those headlines the other day about the Home Office being in a bit of a funk and things being really tricky around all of this, came some briefing suggesting that they were looking at 2 sites, one in East Sussex and one in Inverness. And that's where the conversation has gone today, whether these particular sites are suitable. And effectively what we've had, Adam, is one of those moments, we have had it before in the past around planning developments for new housing, which is where you get national policy running into strong local reaction. And I've been speaking to both the local MPs in Inverness and in that part of East Sussex where the second site would be, and neither of them are remotely keen.
But I suppose it will be, do those opponents have enough political power to prevent it happening?
Completely. So you've got the Cameron Barracks in Inverness, you've got the Crowborough Army Training Camp in East Sussex, so you've got Nuz Ghani, Conservative MP in Sussex, and you've got Angus MacDonald, the Liberal Democrat MP in the Highlands, both saying that they were inadequately consulted. So Mr MacDonald said the first he knew of it was when he was rung up by the Today programme at 7:10, and by 7:15 he was on the radio talking about it. And Nuz Ghani similarly found out once it was kind of out there, if you like, and we were reporting it. They make an argument that these facilities are inadequate. So the one in Inverness, for instance, the MP there saying it's very close to the town centre. Effectively, it would have all of the same problems as a hotel. The government's trying to make an argument that one of the problems with hotels, in addition to cost, is that sense of concerns about community safety. His argument is that same concern would be very real, even though it's a barracks, because it's in a town centre location or pretty close to a town centre. And Nuz Ghani making a similar argument about what she sees as the inadequate nature of this camp near the south coast. But then, of course, you've got others who might say, perhaps it's inevitable as an MP you would represent local concerns and a desire that sites like this are perhaps somewhere else, frankly. But of course, if everyone says that, how on earth as a national government do you confront the issue when people will say the same often about hotels and indeed about these so-called HMOs, the houses of multiple occupation?
And we should just say how this all fits into the asylum system. And if you're a small boat arrival, they initially get processed at this facility in Kent called Manston, where there's been all sorts of problems, including disease outbreaks at one point because it was just overloaded. Then the government houses an asylum seeker for a bit while they're working out what their needs are. And then if that asylum seeker is destitute otherwise and so needs housing, that is when they're then dispersed either to these HMOs or other accommodation, or, as we've been seeing over the last few years, increasingly the hotels. And so these 2 sites would be used as dispersal accommodation for up to about 900 men, the government's saying.
Yeah, and really important, I think, for newscasters to walk through the kind of stages that the government has set out here for how they manage this. And, you come away, Adam, I do today, having been in touch with the Home Office, spoken to these MPs, with that just that deep sense that there's no easy solution here. There's certainly no cheap solution. There's no solution that is wildly popular, and the best the government can hope for is that it is seen to sort of manage it in as sensible and open-minded way as possible, but running up against often loads and loads of local opposition. And and even if these two sites go ahead with the numbers that are being suggested, they are still very, very small numbers relative to the numbers in hotels.
Chris, here's a bit of a curveball. Something that's become a bit of a meme in Westminster the last few days is this idea that Labour ministers are suddenly going, oh, actually, maybe the government before's Rwanda scheme wasn't that bad. Are we to believe that meme or not?
Well, so I think there is not immediately, but it's worth unpicking a little bit. So where are we with all of this? So when I speak to people in government on this whole question of small boats, they acknowledge at the moment that whilst they think they are putting in place a series of things that can make a difference, even if some of them will take some time, a lot of them are, if you like, downstream, as they put it, issues around trying to ensure that fewer of the small boats that are used get as far as the beaches of northern France, for instance. So there's all sorts of things that are going on, which they're hopeful can make a medium-term difference. Someone the other day acknowledged to me that the scale with which the issue is expanding is greater than the expansion of their attempts to sort it out. In other words, the problem getting worse. And to what extent is a deterrent key? Now, the argument from this government, is that the Rwanda scheme was hugely expensive and barely anyone at all was sent there, and those that did had volunteered, and that it was gummed up in the courts, etc., etc. The Conservatives reckon that it was already making some sort of difference as a deterrent. So what else can this government do around deterrence? I was really struck today by the language that Downing Street chose to use when they were making the argument about military sites over hotels. They used the word luxury to describe hotels. Now, you might remember the reporting of our colleague Sue Mitchell a couple of weeks ago around the conditions for many people in hotels, and plenty of MPs who I speak to who have seen those conditions firsthand say not only are they expensive, they're not particularly pleasant for those who are there, but they are perhaps a bit more, a hotel might be a bit more pleasant in terms of its furnishings or whatever than a military barracks. But I think from the government's perspective, when it talks repeatedly about luxury versus basic, it is conscious that it has to win a public argument around the amount of money being spent on hotels. And the very word hotel carries an impression of a certain sense of, if you like, luxury, even if the reality of the experience for so many asylum seekers there would be pretty bleak. And a military base has a sort of more austere kind of vibe to it, doesn't it? So so I think that's kind of where we are with, and they hope, by the way, just to complete the thought, that the prospect of ending up in a military barracks would be a deterrent versus the prospect of a hotel. Who knows? But it's into that space that I think you hear a bit of this stuff around Rwanda, as well as the fact that other countries, not wildly dissimilar from ours, are and have been exploring ideas that might not be the same as the Rwanda scheme, but are broadly in that ballpark, particularly involving other countries. And given the scale of the challenge that so many countries like ours are facing around this whole issue, you do wonder if that sort of thing comes back in time as something that governments will be willing to contemplate.
Well, on that last point, the version of this that Labour have toyed with is offshore processing. So you process people's asylum claims in another country and then let them come to the UK to settle. Now, that's different from the Rwanda scheme, where the idea is that Rwanda would be processing the applications for people to then stay in Rwanda. So that's quite a big difference, even though it can sound like
indeed
it all happening abroad. Chris, thank you very much.
Ta-ra.
About 18 months ago, we did an episode of Newscast where we were chatting to a newscaster who was desperately trying to get out of Khartoum, the capital of Sudan. And the reason he was trying to get away was that two armed groups had turned on each other, and it was the start of a very bloody conflict. The two groups were the Sudanese armed forces and another group called the RSF, who up until that point had been allies and in fact had been partners in a coup together, but had become enemies. It's come roaring back into the headlines, this conflict now, because the RSF have just taken a very strategically important city called El Fasher in Darfur in the west of Sudan. But they've done it using allegedly very, very violent means, killing lots and lots of civilians, although they currently deny doing that. But this adds to the already huge death toll of tens of thousands and 12 million Sudanese people who have become refugees in their own country as a result of this conflict. So we thought we should tune back into what's going on here because, well, the rest of the world is doing exactly that. And also there are quite a lot of interesting international linkages in this bit of Africa. So let's try and join all those dots together now, because here in the studio to help us understand is BBC Chief International Correspondent Lyse Doucet. Hi, Lyse.
Hello, Adam.
And also joining us on the line is Kholood Khair, who runs the Khartoum think tank, the Confluence Advisory, and is a political analyst on Sudan. Hello, Kholood.
Hi, Adam.
So, Lyse, first of all, just give us. We'll go back to the background to this conflict because there's a lot of different strands to it. But just give us a bit of a sit rep now about why it's reached sort of such a peak at the moment.
This is a potentially turning point in the war. The Rapid Support Forces, RSF as they're called, headed by the General Dagalo, who people call Hemeti, has been pushing to try to take the last state capital in Darfur, which is this hugest province, all of the west of Darfur, for more than a year. I was in Sudan and in West Darfur last year at this time and was told, oh, it's going to fall any day now. And his forces have been accused of using every possible technique for enforced starvation, encirclement of Al Fasher, attacks on civilians, accused of war crimes, even accused of genocide. All the warring parties have been accused of all this, but the Rapid Support Forces are the only ones accused of genocide. So they have been pushing and pushing and pushing because they want to have a huge swathe of territory that will allow we'll have to watch, and I'll be interested to see what Kholood says. But in July, the RSF announced an alternative government, a new Sudan. And it's been widely believed that they want Darfur to be their territory, where they can say, this is now under our control. They want all of Sudan, and today we're hearing from RSF people, but this now gives them a big chunk.
And Kholood, why is this being described as such a potentially dangerous moment? Why is this such a risk to the safety of so many people?
Well, because we've seen this playbook before, not only 20 years ago, which is, the events of today are very much a continuation of that, but also just in the past 2 years where, we saw the RSF, which is mostly made up of pastoralist Arab groups, mete out a lot of violence against the Masalit non-Arab group in 2023. Those events were then later designated by the United States government as acts of genocide. And we have effectively been calling, so many of us within the activist, analyst and human rights community, been calling for greater attention on Al-Fasher precisely because we knew that as soon as the RSF took Al-Fasher, it would carry out the kinds of acts of violence that we would see today. But I think even we didn't realize just the extent to which the violence would be carried out. Some groups on the ground are saying 2,000 people have been killed just in the past 48 hours, and we could see this increase exponentially over the next few weeks.
And Lyse, is there an idea of anything that could stop this happening?
It is shocking that when the eyes of the world are on Sudan, that they are acting with such impunity. Today we're hearing about satellite imagery provided by a Yale research lab, which shows quite clearly signs that there are fighters going house to house. In other words, systematic killing, targeted killings, discolored land, horrific to say, which means blood, and grenades mounted on trucks being carried through the area, and aid agencies reporting that even their people are being killed. And as Kholood said, this has happened again and again. It happened 20 years ago when the eyes of the world were on Darfur, and the precursor to the Rapid Support Forces, the Janjaweed militia, were carrying out those kind of attacks. I visited El Janina last year at this time, where every woman I met had a story of the rape and pillage. And because in El Janina, in West Darfur, the RSF and other Arab militias had also been accused of war crimes. And here we are now, El Fasher, and it seems to be happening again. The question is, when are they going to stop? How will they be stopped? They have very powerful allies, most of all the United Arab Emirates, which continues to deny that it is arming the RSF, but yet there continues to be quite significant evidence that they are providing arms and other support to the Rapid Support Forces.
I mean, Kholood, why would the UAE want to get involved in something like this, even though they deny that they are?
Well, several reasons. One, I think for them, this is not just about Sudan. This is about having a grip on Africa, having an anchor in Africa, which they see as the Horn of Africa, they see as their strategic depth, but Africa in general, they see as a vast investment potential. In fact, the UAE actually outspends China and is beloved by the US because of it outspends China in Africa. And so, for them, Sudan is a large country that shares its borders with 7 different African nations. It has access to the Red Sea. It has 2 of the Niles meet in Khartoum and go up to Egypt. It is hugely important in terms of resources, but there's also the gold, which Sudan is very well known for. It's Africa's 3rd largest producer of gold. There's also gum arabic, cattle, and flat arable land that is key for the survival, effectively, of not just the UAE but other Gulf states that do not have as much agricultural land. But beyond that, I think there's this anxiety by not just the UAE but other Gulf countries, but chiefly the UAE, about global de-dollarization. What do you do if the world de-dollarizes and you have an economy that's absolutely reliant on the dollar? We've seen the UAE and Saudi Arabia join the BRICS countries, perhaps in anticipation of that. And in order to backstop a new currency, which the BRICS countries have been threatening to put together, you need things like gold, land, oil, strategic real estate like ports, and data. All of these things are things that the United Arab Emirates have been investing in, and Sudan is key to achieving some of those goals.
So interesting that this incredibly violent conflict that lots of people haven't noticed for a while is about all these very, very modern things, like some countries wanting to set up a rival currency to the US dollar. At least it just seems like sort of kind of from Bitcoin to like these horrible sexual violence in villages. It's just it's quite strange, the linkages
and layers of history. The relationship between the UAE and General Dagalo goes back to another war which no longer is in our headlines, and that's in the Yemen war, where General Dagalo provided forces to the UAE when it was involved in Yemen, in backing groups in Yemen. So he was a very, very useful ally. He also, as Kholood said, gave access to the gold of Sudan, to Dubai, which wants to be it is one of the world's biggest gold centers. General Dagalo is now regarded as one of the richest men in Sudan. He travels to capitals who will let him in a nice suit, and those countries who want to promote him as a leader. And I think we should mention, I'm sure you're going to get on to, and Kholood will have something to say, like all of these, whether it's in Libya or Somalia or any of these countries, all of there's rival groups backing both sides. So you have the UAE on the side of the RSF, on the side of General Bahram and the Sudanese army. You have Egypt, you have Iran, you have Russia, which, not surprising now, has gotten permission to set up a port on the Red Sea. They all want access to the Red Sea. They all want access to Sudan's mineral wealth. They all want access to its agricultural resources. Now, we should also say that they have been trying to push towards peace. Faced with these kind of accusations, in September at the UN General Assembly, a group known as the Quad, which is the US, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the UAE, came up with what they called a roadmap to peace. They were trying to push these two feuding generals, destroying Sudan, to come to the negotiating table. But we're seeing that they're so bent on continuing the war, both of them wanting to control all of Sudan. And so these calls to return, to go to the negotiating table, because there haven't been. Part of the problem, Adam, has been that there's just, even on the mediation front, there has been so many mediators, the United Nations, Saudi Arabia, the US, so that these two generals have been, they call it in that business, mediation shopping. They'll go to one group and say one thing and then go to another. So the negotiating efforts have fallen on deaf ears. The cries from the humanitarian community to let the aid flow to the suffering people of Sudan have also largely fallen on deaf ears.
And Kholood, in terms of the humanitarian situation, I mean, some people listening to this conversation might think this is only really a conflict that's happening in Darfur, in a certain bit of the country, but actually everyone in Sudan is suffering in some way as a result of this.
Absolutely. I mean, for a start, it's the beginning of the dry season. And this is why we have seen the surge in fighting just in the past week. We have not only seen fighting in Al-Fashir, followed by these massacres and these acts of atrocity, but we've also seen them in North Kordofan state, in places like Bara and in and around villages and towns in and around that area. Those two cities and those two towns, Al-Fashir and Bara, lead directly into Khartoum, which is the capital. And so for the RSF, they want to begin this rainy season as they mean to go on. They mean to take Al-Fashir and Bara and also adjacent Al-Ubayd, one of the biggest towns in the Kordofan region, and then subsequently move eastward into Khartoum and then eventually into Port Sudan, which is on the Red Sea, which has always been their military objective. And they have clearly said this in the videos that are circulating after the RSF took Al-Fashir. One thing I would say about the timing of all this, and especially in relation to what Lyse just said about the Quad, is that the RSF has often timed its most heinous atrocities to international mediations and talks in order to provide political cover effectively through these talks for their most heinous atrocities. And this is something that has been very, very successful. We have seen the response to these atrocities committed by the RSF to be, quite lackluster and quite timid by many of the countries and institutions that are either part of the Quad or supporting the Quad. And this is because the RSF has gamed the system. Being part of or participating in these international talks earns you some kudos, which then you can use to mask some of the most terrible crimes. The unfortunate thing for the RSF is that their soldiers or their troops on the ground are actually the ones documenting their own atrocities.
How do you mean?
So all of the videos that we're seeing now, given that there's been a telecommunications blackout in not just Darfur, but other parts of Sudan for more than 18 months, all of the videos that we're seeing are being transmitted through Starlink, which effectively only the RSF really has access to. And all of the videos that we've seen are sort of taken, we have selfies, we have RSF troops showing their faces, killing people in trenches, killing children as they run away, killing, prisoners of war or whom they call prisoners of war, even as they just sat on the ground, effectively awaiting their fate. Some of the most, gory violence that we've seen here, that, as Lyse said, the Yale Observatory has documented, has been actually transmitted to us all through the RSF themselves. And this is because they understand something very key about peacemaking and deal-making in Sudan, which is that for all of Sudan's peacemaking history, particularly in the last 20 or 30 years, transitional justice and any sign of accountability has always been dead last in a series of priorities. And whatever transitional justice, mechanisms or parameters are put into a peace agreement are almost never implemented.
But at least the RSF, despite all those allegations, they say they're not been killing civilians.
They deny all the accusations. So does the Sudanese armed forces. They always deny that they always blame it. They always blame it on the rival. And you're just listening to Kholood. There are many, many tragic elements to what has happened in Sudan since this rivalry erupted in April of 2023. And one is that the Sudanese civilians themselves, the Sudanese NGOs, they really, really have tried. They really have tried to make a difference in Sudan. Some of our listeners may remember the uprising where women played a big role, 2018, 2019. It was called Silmiya, peaceful uprising to get rid of the the 3-decade-long dictatorship of Omar al-Bashir. But then, of course, a transitional military council took over, and like often is the case, they didn't want to give up power. But even during as this war gathered pace, there was a network of Sudanese volunteer organizations, the emergency operations rooms. They were also nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, on the ground, working, trying to, through communities to help people who are suffering in really unimaginable ways, as we heard from Kholood. And Sudan is also a country where such an educated population, when I went there, and Kholood mentioned Port Sudan, which became the alternative capital when they were fighting over Khartoum, the capital. The Sudanese army now controls it since the past few months, but Port Sudan became the alternative place. But it's full of Sudanese professionals, Sudanese engineers, doctors, lawyers, trying to do what they can to really save their country from this utter destruction.
That this is a war against civilians. It is very much a counter-revolutionary war waged by the Sudanese armed forces and the RSF after their coup of 2021 didn't go as planned. And there's this real revenge seeking on the people who led the revolution of 2018, 2019, that pushed back against this idea of a militarized Sudan. But when it comes to targeting civilians, what we have seen the RSF do is, for example, say weeks ahead of time before an attack that there are no civilians left. And this is something they did very assiduously in the lead up to the massacres in al-Fashir. They've said that the 260,000 people, half of whom, 130,000, are children, that the UN has identified as being in al-Fashir up to a few days ago, they've said that none of them are civilians, which effectively gives them a blank check, they believe, to kill as many of them as possible. And that's exactly what we're seeing play out now.
Your take on this, Kholood, is that it would be wrong to think of this as two armed groups fighting for control of the country. This is actually a massive reaction to a sort of grassroots popular uprising of people from all across civil society a few years ago.
It's actually both of those things. SAF and the RSF are fighting each other, but they're fighting each other because they're both the heirs of the Islamist military Omar al-Bashir regime. And once they deposed him together in 2019, they sort of entertained this idea of a civilian military partnership for a few years, and then decided actually it wasn't going to work for them. They didn't want to share their money. They didn't want to dissolve or their troops or make any changes to their armed forces. And they also didn't want to, see themselves hang for all the crimes that they have committed against the Sudanese people for the past, in terms of the Sudanese armed forces, the past 70 years. We have to remember the Sudanese armed forces have quite literally only been fighting and killing the people of Sudan, the civilians of Sudan, and rebel movements in Sudan. And they've never really been an army that defends the people of Sudan. And we're really seeing that play out now. Just when al-Fashir was about to fall to the RSF, the Sudanese armed forces withdrew its troops away to a safer area and effectively left the people of al-Fashir to meet their fate.
Kholood, not to sound distasteful, because you've painted a very, very bleak picture, and obviously you feel very strongly about it all. Is there any optimism here at all?
There certainly is. It's a very slim glimmer, but Lyse has already spoken about this, which is not just the emergency response rooms, but mutual aid writ large. We're seeing in the complete absence and the deterioration of the state, and also in the complete withdrawal, almost complete withdrawal of international aid actors, whether that's the UN or international NGOs, etc. It is people, it is communities that are looking after each other. It is mutual aid groups that have been formed from the first day of the war to take people out of harm's way, to provide food, and especially in areas that have famine, as al-Fashir has been in other parts of the country, and also the ones to provide, for example, women with after-rape care, etc. They are these people working on at the ground and the grassroots levels. They are the state for all intents and purposes. And so to my mind, any peace agreement worth its salt would effectively hand power to people like this, organized groups on the ground, community-based groups, political parties, unions, professional associations who have been doing the lion's share of the state's responsibility over the past 2.5 years, and arguably even before.
Kholood, thank you very much.